Imagine opening your eyes tomorrow morning and finding yourself in a stranger's bedroom, wearing clothes that aren't yours, surrounded by photographs of a family you've never met. Now imagine this happening every single day for the rest of your life, with no way to return to your original existence. This is the reality that began for Daniel Matthews on what should have been an ordinary Wednesday morning in March 2024. Daniel had always been a creature of routine. At 29, he lived alone in a modest studio apartment in Portland, worked as a freelance web developer, and maintained the kind of predictable life that some might call boring but he found comforting. He went to bed on Tuesday night, March 12th, after finishing a particularly challenging coding project, expecting to wake up in his own bed, in his own life, just as he had every day for the past 29 years. Instead, he opened his eyes to find himself staring at a ceiling he didn't recognize, in a bed that wasn't his, in a room filled with someone else's belongings. The first thing Daniel noticed was the smell Marcus expensive cologne mixed with leather and something faintly floral that might have been a woman's perfume. His own apartment smelled like coffee and the faint electronic scent of computer equipment. This room smelled like success, like a life lived in a completely different economic bracket than his own. Daniel sat up carefully, his heart racing as he took in his surroundings. The bedroom was easily 3 times the size of his entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking what appeared to be Central Park. Expensive-looking artwork hung on the walls, and the furniture had the kind of understated elegance that screamed money. But it was the photographs on the nightstand that truly confused him. They showed a man who looked exactly like Daniel Dallas, same brown hair, same green eyes, same slightly crooked nose from a childhood soccer injury, but dressed in expensive suits and surrounded by people Daniel had never seen before. In one photo, the Daniel who wasn't Daniel was cutting a ribbon at what appeared to be some kind of business opening. In another, he was embracing a stunning blonde woman in what was clearly a wedding photo. Daniel stumbled to the bathroom and stared at his reflection in the mirror. It was definitely his face, but something was different. His jawline seemed more defined, his teeth were straighter than he remembered, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow that he'd never had before. When he looked down at his hands, he found a wedding ring on his finger, a heavy platinum band that felt foreign against his skin. His first thought was that he was dreaming. His second thought was that he was having some kind of psychotic break. His third thought, which came as he heard a woman's voice calling Marcus, "Honey, are you up?" from downstairs, was that he might be trapped in someone else's life. The woman who appeared in the doorway of the bedroom was the same blonde from the wedding photo, though older now, probably in her early 30s. She was beautiful in the way that comes from good genetics and expensive skincare, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, approaching him with the casual intimacy of a long-married couple. "You were tossing and turning all night. Bad dreams again." Daniel opened his mouth to explain that he had no idea who she was or where he was, but what came out instead was, "Yeah, sorry. I think I'm still stressed about the merger." The words had come from his mouth, but they weren't his thoughts. It was as if someone else was speaking through him, someone who knew about mergers, and had a wife and lived in what was clearly a multi-million-dollar apartment. "Well, don't forget we have dinner with my parents tonight," the woman continued. "Mom specifically requested that you wear the navy suit. She thinks it makes you look distinguished." Daniel nodded, though he had no memory of planning any dinner or owning a navy suit. "Right, of course." After the woman knocked, whose name he still didn't know, left for what she mentioned was her yoga class, Daniel spent the morning exploring the apartment like an archaeologist, trying to piece together a civilization. From the mail on the kitchen counter, he learned that he was apparently Marcus Thornton, a 32-year-old investment banker who lived at one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses. His wife was named Isabella, and they had been married for 3 years according to the anniversary card he found in a desk drawer. The most disturbing discovery came when Daniel found Marcus's driver's license. The photo was definitely his face, but the birthday listed was 3 years later than his own, and the signature at the bottom was in handwriting that looked like his but felt foreign when he tried to replicate it. Daniel spent the entire day in a state of barely controlled panic, trying to navigate a life that felt like an elaborate costume he couldn't remove. Marcus's phone contained contacts he didn't recognize, appointment reminders for meetings about subjects he knew nothing about, and text message conversations that referenced shared memories he'd never experienced. When Isabella returned from yoga, she seemed to notice nothing unusual about his behavior. When he claimed to have a headache to avoid conversations about people and events he knew nothing about, she was sympathetic and understanding. When he suggested they order takeout instead of going to her parents' house, she was surprised but accommodating. It was as if the world had conspired to make this impossible situation feel normal. That night, lying in bed next to a woman who clearly loved him, but whom he'd never met before that morning, Daniel tried to make sense of what was happening to him. Had he suffered some kind of memory loss? Was this an elaborate prank, a government experiment, a simulation? But none of those explanations could account for the physical differences he'd noticed. The scar, the straighter teeth, the wedding ring that fit perfectly despite never having worn one before. It was as if he had somehow slipped into a parallel version of his life, one where he'd made different choices and become a different person. When Daniel closed his eyes that night, he desperately hoped he would wake up in his own bed, in his own life, with this bizarre experience relegated to the category of extremely vivid dreams. Instead, he woke up in a different bed, in a different room, in what appeared to be a different life entirely. This time, he was in a small bedroom that smelled like baby powder and exhaustion. The bed was unmade. There were children's toys scattered on the floor, and he could hear the sound of cartoons playing downstairs. When he looked at the nightstand, he found photographs of himself, but not himself as Marcus the investment banker. This version of Daniel had laugh lines around his eyes, and was pictured with two small children, and a woman with kind eyes and curly red hair. According to the documents he found, he was now David Mitchell, a 31-year-old elementary school teacher from suburban Ohio. He was married to a woman named Sarah, and they had two children, Emma, age 6, and Michael, age 4. When he looked in the bathroom mirror, his reflection showed the same differences he'd noticed as Marcus, but these were different differences. This version of himself had a small gap between his front teeth and a freckle on his neck that he'd never had before. "Daddy," came a voice from the hallway, followed by the sound of small feet running toward the bedroom. A little girl with curly red hair like her mother's burst through the door and launched herself onto the bed. "Mommy made pancakes." David felt an overwhelming surge of emotion as he looked at this child who was apparently his daughter. She had his green eyes but her mother's smile, and when she hugged him he felt a love so intense it was almost painful, but it was a love for a child he'd never met, in a life he'd never lived. "Come on, Daddy," Emma said, tugging at his hand. "Mickey's already eating all the good ones." Downstairs, Daniel found Sarah in the kitchen, efficiently managing the morning chaos of getting two small children fed and ready for the day. She was wearing scrubs, apparently a nurse, and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple crises simultaneously. "Morning, Aunt," she said, giving him a quick kiss as she handed him a cup of coffee. "Can you get Emma's backpack ready? She has show and tell today, and she wants to bring that rock collection you helped her organize." Again, Daniel found himself responding with knowledge he didn't possess. "Right, the rock collection. Did she decide on the pyrite or the quartz?" "Pyrite," Sarah said with a smile. "She likes the way it sparkles." As Daniel helped Emma gather her rocks and listened to 4-year-old Michael chatter about his favorite cartoon characters, he was struck by how natural this life felt despite being completely foreign to him. His hands knew where the coffee mugs were kept. His body moved through the house with familiarity, and his responses to his family came from some deep place that seemed to contain memories of experiences he'd never had. The pattern continued the next day, when he woke up as Dr. Daniel Reeves, a 35-year-old surgeon in Seattle who lived alone in a sleek modern condo and seemed to dedicate every waking moment to his work. The day after that, he was Danny Rodriguez, a 28-year-old artist in Santa Fe, who lived in a converted garage and painted landscapes that somehow captured emotions he'd never learned to express. Each morning brought a new life, a new identity, a new set of relationships and responsibilities that somehow felt both completely foreign and deeply familiar. Daniel began to realize that these weren't random lives he was experiencing. They seemed to be variations on his own life, different paths he might have taken if he'd made different choices, or if circumstances had been different. Marcus represented the path of financial success and material comfort. David showed him a life of family and domestic happiness. Dr. Reeves embodied professional achievement and dedication to helping others. Danny the artist revealed a creative side of himself that his original life had never explored. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of his situation was how naturally he seemed to fit into each life. Despite having no memories of these existences, his body carried the muscle memory of Marcus's golf swing, David's ability to comfort crying children, Dr. Reeves' surgical precision, and Danny's artistic techniques. It was as if multiple versions of himself existed simultaneously, and he was somehow accessing them one at a time. Daniel began keeping a journal, writing down everything he could remember about each life before the details faded. He documented the names of family members, the addresses of homes, the details of careers he'd never pursued. What emerged was a complex map of possibility, a catalog of all the different people he might have become. Some lives were better than others. The life of Marcus offered luxury and prestige but felt hollow and disconnected. David's life was filled with love and meaning but came with financial stress and little time for personal pursuits. Dr. Reeves saved lives but had sacrificed personal relationships for professional success. Danny had creative fulfillment but struggled with loneliness and uncertainty about the future. None of the lives was perfect, but each offered something valuable that the others lacked. As weeks passed and Daniel continued his journey through alternate versions of himself, he began to notice patterns and connections between the lives. Events that occurred in one life often had echoes in others. A woman he met as a colleague in Marcus's world appeared as a patient's family member in Dr. Reeves's life. A location that held significance for David showed up in one of Danny's paintings. It was as if all these lives existed simultaneously in some vast network of possibility, connected by invisible threads of cause and effect, choice and consequence. The breakthrough in understanding came during his time as Professor Daniel Chen, a quantum physicist at Stanford, who was researching the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. In this life, Daniel had dedicated years to studying the theoretical possibility that every quantum event created multiple parallel universes, each representing a different outcome. Sitting in Professor Chen's office surrounded by equations and papers about parallel realities, Daniel suddenly understood what was happening to him. He wasn't jumping between different lives randomly. He was experiencing what Dr. Chen's research suggested was theoretically possible, consciousness sliding between parallel versions of reality. But understanding what was happening didn't answer the crucial question why. The answer came to him gradually as he experienced more lives and began to see the larger pattern. Each life he visited seemed to teach him something important about himself, about the choices that defined a person, about the different aspects of human experience that could be emphasized or neglected. Marcus taught him about ambition and its costs. David showed him the power of love and family. Dr. Reeves demonstrated the satisfaction of service and the danger of isolation. Danny revealed the importance of creativity and self-expression. Professor Chen offered the value of intellectual curiosity and the pursuit of truth. Daniel began to realize that he was being given an extraordinary education in what it meant to be human, experiencing firsthand the full spectrum of choices and their consequences. But he also began to understand that this journey had a purpose beyond education. It was preparing him for something. The clue came when he started encountering the same challenges across multiple lives. In each existence there came a moment of crucial decision, a crossroads where the version of himself he was inhabiting had to choose between competing values or conflicting desires. As Marcus, he had to decide whether to proceed with a merger that would make him wealthy but cost hundreds of people their jobs. As David, he faced the choice between accepting a promotion that would benefit his family financially but require moving away from elderly parents who needed care. As Dr. Reeves, he had to choose between a prestigious research position and staying to serve patients in an understaffed urban hospital. Each time, Daniel found himself making decisions that felt right on a deep level, choices that balanced multiple considerations and honored different aspects of what mattered in human life. And each time he noticed that his decisions seemed to create positive ripples that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Marcus's choice to restructure the merger to preserve jobs led to innovations that benefited the entire industry. David's decision to find a creative solution that allowed him to advance his career while staying near his parents inspired others to seek similar balance. Dr. Reeves' commitment to his patients led to breakthrough treatments that helped people around the world. Daniel began to understand that his journey through these alternate lives wasn't just about experiencing different possibilities. It was about learning to make choices that honored the full complexity of human existence, decisions that integrated multiple values rather than sacrificing some for others. But the most profound realization came when Daniel began to remember things that hadn't happened in any of the lives he was experiencing. He would be walking down a street as Marcus and suddenly recall a conversation he'd had as David. He would be performing surgery as Dr. Reeves and find himself drawing on artistic techniques he'd learned as Danny. The boundaries between the different lives were beginning to blur, and Daniel was becoming something new, not just one version of himself but a synthesis of all the possibilities he'd experienced. This integration accelerated when Daniel encountered what he began to think of as crossover moments, instances where the different lives seemed to influence each other directly. A decision he made as Marcus affected the stock price of a company where David's wife Sarah worked. A patient that Dr. Reeves treated turned out to be the parent of one of Emma's classmates in David's life. A painting that Danny created inspired a breakthrough in Professor Chen's research. Daniel realized that all these lives existed simultaneously, not as separate parallel universes but as interconnected aspects of a larger reality. His consciousness wasn't jumping between different worlds, it was learning to perceive the multidimensional nature of existence itself. The culmination of this journey came when Daniel woke up in a life he hadn't experienced before, but which felt more familiar than any of the others. He was in his original apartment in Portland, but it was different, filled with photographs and mementos from all the lives he'd experienced. There were pictures of Isabella and Sarah and Emma and Michael, certificates from his work as Dr. Reeves, paintings by Danny and research papers by Professor Chen. But more than the physical evidence, Daniel found that he had access to all the knowledge, skills, and emotional experiences from every life he'd lived. He could perform surgery with Dr. Reeves's precision, paint with Danny's artistic vision, love with David's open heart, achieve with Marcus's determination, and understand with Professor Chen's intellectual clarity. Daniel had become not just one version of himself, but the integrated sum of all his possibilities. The journal entry he wrote that morning captured the transformation. I understand now what this journey has been about. It wasn't about choosing between different lives, or finding the right version of myself. It was about learning that human consciousness is far more vast and complex than we imagine. We're not limited to one set of choices, one path, one identity. We contain multitudes narrowed, all the possibilities we might explore, all the people we might become, all the love we might give and receive. The different lives I experienced weren't separate reality, they were different aspects of my complete self, different facets of human potential that I was learning to access and integrate. Now I understand that every person contains this same vastness, this same potential for multiple ways of being. We think we have to choose between being successful or being loving, between being creative or being practical, between serving others or fulfilling ourselves. But the truth is that we can learn to be all of these things, to honor all aspects of human possibility without sacrificing any of them. My journey through these lives has taught me that consciousness itself is multidimensional, that we exist simultaneously across multiple levels of possibility, and that learning to access and integrate these different aspects of ourselves is perhaps the next stage of human evolution. I'm still Daniel Matthews, the web developer from Portland, but I'm also Marcus and David and Dr. Reeves and Danny and Professor Chen and all the other versions of myself I've experienced. I'm all the choices I've made and all the choices I might yet make. I'm all the love I've given and received across multiple lifetimes of experience compressed into a single awakening consciousness. And I suspect that everyone has this potential might to wake up not just to who they are, but to who they might be, to all the vast possibilities that consciousness contains. Daniel closed the journal and looked around his apartment, his original apartment, but transformed by his expanded understanding of what was possible. He had work to do, lives to live, choices to make that would honor all aspects of his integrated self. But first, he had some phone calls to make. Somewhere in this reality, there were people named Isabella and Sarah and Emma and Michael, who might be waiting to meet the version of himself, who had learned to love with the full capacity of a consciousness that had experienced every possible way of being human. The man who had woken up every morning in someone else's life, had finally awakened to the truth that every life he'd experienced had been his own different expressions of the infinite potential that consciousness contains when it learns to transcend the limitations of linear identity and embrace the vast multidimensional nature of what it truly means to be alive. But Daniel's transformation was only the beginning of a much larger story that would unfold over the months that followed his integration. The first sign that his experience was part of something greater came when he received an unexpected email 3 weeks after his awakening. The sender was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins, who had been researching cases of what she called multidimensional consciousness phenomena. Mr. Matthews, the email read, I realize this may sound unusual, but I've been tracking reports of individuals experiencing what you've described in a blog post you published about living multiple lives simultaneously. I'm wondering if you might be willing to participate in some research that could help us understand what's happening to people like you. Daniel stared at the email, realizing he had no memory of publishing any blog post. But when he searched online, he found an extensive website under his name documenting his journey through different lives, complete with detailed descriptions of each existence and philosophical reflections on the nature of consciousness and identity. The writing was definitely his Mare's. He recognized his style and thought patterns, but it was as if one of his alternate selves had been documenting the experience while he was living it. As he read through the posts, he found insights and observations that he remembered thinking but had never written down, as well as perspectives that felt familiar yet new. The blog had attracted a small but devoted following of people who resonated with his descriptions of multidimensional existence. Some shared their own experiences of feeling like they were living multiple lives. Others described dreams so vivid they felt like memories of alternate selves, and a few claimed to have encountered people who seemed to be different versions of themselves. When Daniel called Dr. Vasquez, he learned that his case was part of a pattern she'd been observing for over 2 years. There's something happening to human consciousness, she explained during their first video call. We're seeing an increasing number of people reporting experiences that suggest awareness is becoming less bound by traditional linear constraints. Your case is one of the most detailed and articulated we've encountered. Dr. Vasquez had been collaborating with researchers around the world to study what they were calling consciousness expansion phenomena. The cases varied widely. Some people reported accessing memories from what seemed to be past lives, others experienced precognitive dreams with startling accuracy, and a few, like Daniel, seemed to be accessing parallel versions of their current existence. What's particularly interesting about your case, Dr. Vasquez continued, is the integration you've achieved. Most people who experience these phenomena struggle to reconcile the different perspectives and memories. You seem to have found a way to synthesize them into a coherent sense of self. Daniel agreed to participate in her research, which involved extensive brain scans, psychological evaluations, and detailed documentation of his ongoing experiences. What the tests revealed was unprecedented. His brain showed activity patterns that suggested he was simultaneously processing information from multiple timelines or dimensional states. It's as if your consciousness has learned to exist in a quantum superposition, Dr. Vasquez explained as they reviewed his brain scans. Most human awareness operates in what we might call a single-state reality, but your neural patterns suggest you're maintaining coherent access to multiple probability states simultaneously. The research attracted the attention of Dr. James Wright, the quantum physicist who had been studying temporal consciousness phenomena. When he joined the research team, he brought with him data from similar cases around the world and a theory that began to explain what Daniel and others were experiencing. What if, Dr. Wright proposed during one of their research sessions, human consciousness is evolving? What if we're witnessing the emergence of a new kind of awareness that can transcend the limitations that have defined human experience for millennia? Dr. Wright's theory was that certain individuals were developing what he called multidimensional consciousness, plus the ability to access and integrate information from multiple probability states or parallel versions of reality. This wasn't just theoretical speculation. The brain scans and behavioral observations from Daniel and others provided measurable evidence of consciousness operating in ways that had previously been considered impossible. As word of the research spread through academic and online communities, Daniel found himself at the center of a growing movement of people exploring the boundaries of human awareness. His blog became a hub for individuals sharing their own experiences of expanded consciousness, and he began receiving messages from around the world. One message, from a woman named Sarah Chen in Vancouver, particularly caught his attention. She described experiencing something she called parallel life bleeding. Moments when she would suddenly have detailed knowledge of alternative versions of her life, complete with memories of different career paths, relationships, and life choices. The strangest part, Sarah wrote, is that these alternate memories feel completely real and are often more vivid than my actual memories. I know things about alternate versions of myself that I couldn't possibly know, and sometimes I catch myself responding to situations based on experiences I've never actually had. Another message came from Marcus Thornton, a programmer in London who had been experiencing what he called quantum dreams for over a year. I dream about different versions of my life every night, he explained. But they're not random fantasies, they're coherent, continuing narratives about alternate paths I might have taken. Sometimes I wake up with solutions to problems I've never encountered, or skills I've never learned, or profound emotional connections to people I've never met. As Daniel connected with more people experiencing similar phenomena, he began to see patterns that suggested something unprecedented was happening to human consciousness on a global scale. The experiences weren't random or isolated, they seemed to be part of a coordinated expansion of human awareness. This realization deepened when Daniel began having direct connections with some of his alternate selves. Instead of waking up in different lives, he started experiencing what he could only describe as conscious meetings with other versions of himself. These encounters typically occurred during deep meditation or in the liminal space between sleeping and waking. Daniel would find himself in what seemed to be a neutral space, sometimes visualized as a vast library, sometimes as a peaceful garden, sometimes as a simple room with comfortable chairs, where he could communicate directly with alternate versions of himself. The conversations with his alternate selves were unlike anything Daniel had experienced. Marcus the banker shared insights about navigating complex financial and social systems. David the teacher offered wisdom about patience, nurturing, and the long-term impact of small daily choices. Dr. Reeves provided perspectives on life, death, and the profound responsibility of caring for others. Danny the artist revealed approaches to creativity and authentic self-expression that transcended conventional thinking. But these weren't just philosophical exchanges. Daniel found that knowledge and skills acquired during these meetings carried over into his daily life. After a conversation with Dr. Reeves about surgical techniques, Daniel discovered he could perform complex first aid procedures he'd never learned. Following a discussion with Danny about color theory and emotional expression, Daniel found himself creating art that captured feelings he'd never been able to articulate. The most profound meetings were with versions of himself that existed in realities where he had made radically different fundamental choices. There was a version who had become a spiritual teacher after a near-death experience in his 20s, another who had dedicated his life to environmental activism after witnessing climate change firsthand, one who had become a single father after his wife's death and had learned depths of love and resilience he'd never imagined possible. Each encounter expanded Daniel's understanding not just of his own potential, but of the vast spectrum of human experience and the countless ways consciousness could express itself. But perhaps the most significant development came when Daniel began encountering people from his alternate lives in his original reality. Walking down a street in Portland, he would sometimes see Isabella, the woman who had been Marcus's wife. She would be a stranger to him in this reality, but their eyes would meet with a flash of recognition that neither could explain. Once while grocery shopping he encountered Emma, the little girl who had been his daughter in David's life. She was with her mother, who in this reality was a different woman entirely. But when Emma saw Daniel, she broke away from her mother and ran to hug his legs, calling him daddy before her confused mother pulled her away. These encounters suggested that the boundaries between the different realities were becoming increasingly permeable, not just for Daniel but for everyone involved in his multidimensional existence. Dr. Vasquez and her team documented these incidents with growing excitement and concern. What you're experiencing, she told Daniel during one of their sessions, appears to be a form of consciousness that transcends individual identity. It's as if you're becoming a bridge between different probability states, allowing information and even relationships to flow between parallel realities. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could indeed access and integrate multiple dimensional states, it suggested that human awareness was far more vast and powerful than anyone had previously imagined. But it also raised profound questions about the nature of identity, free will, and the structure of reality itself. These questions became urgently practical when Daniel began experiencing what he called reality negotiations, situations where his actions in one-dimensional state appeared to influence outcomes in others. A decision he made during a meeting with his alternate selves would sometimes result in synchronicities or opportunities appearing in his daily life. Conversely, choices he made in his Portland existence seemed to create positive changes in the lives of his alternate selves. The breakthrough in understanding came when Dr. Wright's research team made a startling discovery. Using advanced quantum measurement techniques, they found evidence that Daniel's consciousness was actually creating measurable changes in the quantum field around him. His brain activity seemed to be generating what they called probability waves that could influence the likelihood of certain outcomes occurring. You're not just accessing alternate realities, Dr. Wright explained. You're actually helping to create them. Your integrated consciousness is functioning as a kind of quantum field generator, influencing the probability patterns that determine which potential realities become actual experiences. This discovery transformed Daniel's understanding of his role in the phenomenon he was experiencing. He wasn't just a passive observer of multiple reality, he was an active participant in shaping them. His choices, insights, and the integration he had achieved were literally helping to create new possibilities for human consciousness and experience. With this realization came a profound sense of responsibility. If his consciousness could influence reality across multiple dimensional states, then every choice he made carried implications far beyond his personal experience. He was not just living his own life, he was helping to weave the fabric of possibility for all the alternate selves and realities he was connected to. Daniel began approaching his daily life with this expanded awareness. Every decision was made with consideration for how it might affect not just his immediate circumstances, but the network of connected realities he was part of. This led to a way of living that was both deeply grounded in practical concerns and elevated by awareness of vast implications. The results were remarkable. As Daniel learned to make choices that honored the full spectrum of his multidimensional existence, his life in Portland began to flourish in unexpected ways. Opportunities appeared that seemed perfectly aligned with his diverse range of skills and interests. Relationships developed that had the depth and meaning he had experienced across multiple lifetimes. Work projects emerged that allowed him to integrate the professional expertise he had gained through his alternate selves. But perhaps most significantly, Daniel began to notice that other people in his life were also experiencing expansions of consciousness and possibility. His neighbor started having dreams about alternative career paths and eventually made changes that brought greater fulfillment. A colleague began describing experiences of knowing things she had never learned, leading to innovations in her work that benefited many people. It was as if Daniel's integrated consciousness was creating a field of expanded possibility that influenced everyone around him. 6 months after his initial integration, Daniel received a message that would change his understanding of his experience once more. The message came not through email or phone, but through the same kind of direct consciousness communication he had learned to have with his alternate selves. But this message came from someone else entirely, a woman whose consciousness had also achieved multidimensional integration, and who had been experiencing her own journey through alternate versions of her life. Daniel, the message came through clearly during one of his meditation sessions. My name is Sarah, and I think we need to meet. I've been having experiences very similar to yours, and I believe what's happening to us is part of something much larger than individual consciousness expansion. There are others more of us than you might think, and we're all connected in ways that are just beginning to become clear. The message included an address in Vancouver and an invitation to visit when he felt ready. Daniel realized that his journey was entering a new phase. He had learned to integrate multiple versions of himself and to live with expanded consciousness in his daily life. But now it appeared that his individual transformation was part of a collective awakening, a network of people around the world who were developing similar capabilities and who might need to work together to understand and responsibly develop this new form of human awareness. As Daniel prepared for his trip to Vancouver to meet Sarah, he reflected on how far he had traveled from that first morning when he had awakened in Marcus's bedroom, terrified and confused by finding himself in someone else's life. He now understood that there had never been someone else's life. There had only been different expressions of his own vast potential, different ways consciousness could manifest itself across the infinite landscape of possibility. And now it seemed he was about to discover that his own expansion was connected to a larger awakening that might represent the next stage of human evolution. The man who had once thought he was trapped in other people's lives was about to learn that he had been preparing to help humanity step into entirely new ways of being conscious, connected, and alive. But that, Daniel realized, as he packed for his journey north, was a story that was just beginning to unfold, not just for him, but for the countless people around the world who were awakening to the vast multidimensional nature of consciousness itself. His personal transformation had been profound, but it was only the first movement in a symphony of human potential that was about to reshape understanding of what it truly meant to be alive, aware and connected to the infinite possibilities that consciousness contains.